as a boy and who's known the industry all his life. Still, Loyola Hearn insists Canada was right to oppose a ban on deep-sea bottom trawling.
Loyola Hearn says the issue of bottom trawling is just one small part of a major UN resolution on sustainable fisheries.
The resolution itself was all-encompassing in relation to really dealing with creating a sustainable fishery, preserving the habitat, use of proper gear, use of science, using the precautionary principle, cracking down on offenders, closing port. It just went on and on.
Hearn says an outright ban wouldn't work. There's no way to enforce it. But he says if all countries meet the other commitments in the resolution, they would be compelled to fish responsibly.
To support the moratorium would have killed the opportunity to bring all people in as a consensus on the major resolution.
Some people believe the Canadian government is just trying to protect Clearwater and FPI, the big fishing companies, from any suggestion that bottom trawling ought to be stopped in Canadian waters. Is that the case?
Certainly it is part of the decision, because we would, if we banned bottom trawling, period, across the board, we would wipe out many of the coastal communities in Canada, and certainly in other parts of the world. Look at Spain, Portugal, etc. A lot of their fish is caught.
You know as well as I do, there are fishermen who argue that if you continue the dragging, you're going to wipe out those communities anyway, because you're going to wipe out the fishery. What do you say to that?
Well, the thing is, number one, first of all, these would be fishermen who don't use trawls, of course.
Yes.
And that would eliminate all your shrimp fishermen, because the shrimp fishery is a big one certainly in Atlantic Canada right now, and in many parts of Canada. It would eliminate any bottom fish like your yellowtail, plaice, etc., etc. So you would take, probably in Newfoundland and Labrador, 50% of the people right out of the fishery, and you're back to hook and line and maybe gill nets, which people will also argue can be very, very damaging if they're left in the water to continue fishing, etc. Which makes the point that I want to make, is that any technology is only as good or as bad as where it's used and how it's used.
The UN debate over bottom trawling became a hot issue, and not just among environmentalists. Newspaper columnists and editorials voiced support for a ban on trawling. And naturally, the issue of bottom trawling in Canadian waters is part of the discussion.
In Nova Scotia, bottom trawling, or dragging as fishermen here call it, is a huge industry. It's worth about $500 million a year. Draggers catch not just fish, but also scallops, clams, and shrimp. In fact, trawling is the only way to catch shrimp. Many fishermen and environmentalists blame the collapse of the cod fishery 15 years ago, and the decline of other fisheries since, on draggers. They argue that draggers simply take too much fish and destroy habitat in the process. Wayne Eddy is a director of the Eastern Shore Fishermen's Association in Nova Scotia. He used to fish with a long line, which uses hooks, and he believes draggers have done a lot of damage.
I've seen it go from rocks and coral and kelp and everything on the bottom. Little bits used to come up on your hooks, and you went back to that same spot after they were finished with it for 4 or 5 years, and it was nothing but sand and mud come up on your hooks.
Wayne Eddy remembers his reaction when the Canadian Minister of Fisheries announced that Canada was against a moratorium on deep-sea bottom trawling.
What did you think?
I couldn't believe it. I said, him coming from an inshore fishery in Newfoundland, from a fishing community that has inshore fishing, and now see, here's where your large cooperation comes in, because the fish plants, these fish draggers that are bringing in lots of fish are supplying jobs to the fish plants, and these processors and large corporations are one that's controlling it. They don't care. Okay, we're making a few jobs for a few people, but then them jobs are not going to last very long. What they're doing now, they're actually sacrificing the fish that's out there now for short-term work.
Well, this net is actually rolled up on a drum right now, but it's a funnel. It's shaped like a long, narrow funnel. Wider.
But then there's Brian Giroux, who represents many of Nova Scotia's dragger fishermen. Giroux acknowledges there are more than 100 draggers working in the waters off Nova Scotia. But he is adamant that draggers are not the destructive fishing machines they've been made out to be.
If it's properly done in a reasonable way, in a reasonable environment, it's negligible, the impact. It can recover within months. If it's in a very sensitive environment or an environment that has you know, softer bottom and less energy, so to speak, then the marks may be visible for a long period of time.
Large stretches of ocean floor off the Nova Scotia coast are nothing more than gravel. There's not much to destroy here, although no one is sure what was on the seafloor before draggers began their work in the 1950s. Brian Giroux contends that Nova Scotian draggers now avoid ocean bottom, which is environmentally sensitive. Environmentalists, he says, are attacking draggers to raise money.
25 years ago, if you wanted a housewife to send you money, you showed people a picture of a baby seal getting its head clubbed in. Well, now it's the dragger that's the being demonized, and send us money and we'll stop the dragger fisheries.
Yeah, but the cod fishery, the ground fishery, collapsed in the meantime. That's what you seem to be neglecting.
It didn't collapse.
It
didn't collapse because of this.
There was, if the ground fishery did not collapse because of draggers, what caused its collapse?
Massive environmental shift, for one thing. You can look at the temperature profiles here and see 6 and 7 degree differences in temperatures between now and the 60s.
Are you telling me that dragger technology has had no effect on the decline of the Atlantic fishing?
No, I'm not saying it's had no effect. Any technology, overused and or inappropriately used or not controlled, can have detrimental effects.
Scientists can't say precisely why the East Coast fishery collapsed. They believe it happened because of a combination of factors, including overfishing. But in today's fishing industry, there remains a corporate attitude that appears to value profit over conservation. John Risley, head of Clearwater Seafoods, is convinced bottom trawling does no damage in Canadian waters where his vessels fish.
There is zero scientific evidence, not one shred of scientific evidence, that these fisheries do any damage to the bottom environment whatsoever.
In fact, a recent United Nations environmental report confirms trawling is harmful to certain ocean habitats. The report notes dozens of spots, mostly coral reefs, where damage has been documented, including coral grounds off Nova Scotia.
Scientists at the Department of Fisheries and Oceans did their own research on bottom trawling. And their conclusion? Bottom trawling is harmful to certain types of ocean bottom.
The West Coast.
Dr. Jake Rice is a senior scientist with the Department of Fisheries and Oceans.
The latest science on the effects of bottom trawling tells us that it can be detrimental to habitats, communities, and species on the seafloor, but it depends on the history of the area, the type of habitat, and the type of species that are there.
Scientists agree that trawling over muddy bottom or thick gravel is relatively harmless. In Nova Scotia, sensitive underwater habitats, including deep coral reefs, are now closed to fishing. The draggers face strict rules for quota, mesh size, and enforcement. Still, many fishermen are convinced the draggers are taking too many fish.
Dr. Rice, on the wharves of Atlantic Canada, the fishermen will tell you that bottom trawling, or dragging as they call it, is simply wrong. They believe they have seen evidence that it is destroying the ocean bottom and fish habitat and wrecking the fishery.
Fishermen are smart. They know marine ecosystems very well. I would show them the evidence that the net productivity of the system is not diminished by these trawls. I'd show them the policies and the size of the footprint of these trawl fisheries and show that whatever effect these trawls are having, it's not the cause of the failure of cod to recover, the other problems we're facing in these fisheries right now.
The department, it seems, has work to do to convince some fishermen that draggers have a place in the fishery.
It cleaned it out in less than 50 years, or 50 years. Now we got more technology, bigger boats, bigger gear, more technology. It's not going to take them that long to take the rest of it. The rest of it's going to be gone.
When we come back, environmentalists say their loss at the